Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for a CMMC Final Rule discussion. We may have some more people that'll be popping in, but I want to go ahead and get started. We appreciate you taking the time to be with us and to discuss this important topic. So I do want to be respectful of everyone's time, so we will kind of get our program moving forward. Just a quick introduction. Alluvionic, we are a project solution company. We were founded in 2013. We have a variety of certifications in contract vehicles, you will notice. We are a cyber accreditation body registered practitioner organization, an RPO, and we have been an RPO since 2020 when CMMC was first introduced, and we've been supporting companies, about 125 now over the last few years, in their readiness efforts to prepare for CMMC. We provide project management, process improvement, training, cybersecurity, and product development to commercial business as well as to the government. So today we are here to discuss the CMMC Final Rule. There is a lot of enthusiasm and excitement right now as this rule has been published. So we want to kind of give you guys a little bit of background on CMMC, talk about some of the things that are of interest within the final rule, and we want to hear from you. So we will allocate some time at the conclusion for questions. We do ask that you keep your mics muted at this point in our program, but we do have a Q&A feature here in the Teams. If you look up to the top, you should see a Q&A icon up there. So if you have a really exciting question, a burning question, please go ahead and use that feature to get your question in there, and we will hope to be able to get to that at the end. We should have plenty of time to do so. So I am Lizzie High. I oversee our commercial services here at Alluvionic, and I am pleased to work with a team of awesome cyber analysts, and we have a couple of them here with us today. I do want to turn it over to each of them just to do a quick self-introduction before we start moving forward. So Bobby Padilla, if you would go first.
Sorry. Sure. Thanks, Lizzie. My name is Bobby Padilla. I am the Information Security Director here at Alluvionic, and also one of our NIST and CMMC compliance assessors. I have about 25 years of experience supporting the Department of Defense in both IT and information security roles. And I have been with Alluvionic for over 4 years now, primarily supporting our NIST and CMMC compliance efforts. I'm also a certified CMMC professional, and I've helped organizations in the defense industrial base with assessments, consulting, and remediation efforts, probably about 20 to 25 projects in my 4 years here at Alluvionic. So happy to be here and help any way I can.
Thank you, Bobby. Caitlin, turn to you.
Thank you, Lizzie. Welcome, everyone. My name is Caitlin Pasego, and I am Alluvionic's Information Technology Manager, as well as a Cybersecurity Compliance Analyst. I hold an undergraduate degree in cybersecurity with an emphasis in computer systems and networks, and a master's degree in information technology with a specialization in network management. Over the years, I've maintained numerous industry certifications alongside the CISP certification, which is the Certified Information System Security Professional, sponsored by the ISC Squared organization. I'm a Navy veteran, and due to my background, I approach compliance with discipline and strategic insight. And I want to thank you all for being here today. And I'll pass off the mic to Dustin, if it's okay, Lizzie.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Dustin Dabbs. I am one of the compliance analysts here, primarily geared towards working on gap analysis and remediation projects. I've been with Alluvionic for about 3 years, give or take, including an internship. And I'm excited to present to everyone.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dustin. So This group, along with others on our team, have really been on the front line supporting some of you. So I know we do have some past customers that are joining us today. So these might be some familiar faces, and they have been working with a variety of companies. So they bring a lot of insight because they've seen how CMMC is impacting businesses of all sizes. You know, we've worked with companies that had 1 or 2 employees to companies that were much larger, and all really looking at how to tackle these controls, how they would be implemented within their organizations. So we are going to dive into the final rule, but we recognize that many of you have been following CMMC for a while, but maybe haven't been following it as closely as you are now, recognizing that the rule is now finalized. So we do want to start with just a little bit of background and really lay the history of CMMC, where it's been, so that we can kind of move into where it's going. So Caitlin, if you would help us just talk us through a little bit of the background of what the DoD has been doing to put this process in place.
Absolutely. Thank you, Lizzie. So yes, while CMMC was just finalized, it is not a new requirement. If we go back to 2007, that was when the Defense Industrial Base Cybersecurity Task Force was established. And that's all in an effort to build a strategy to shore up the critically important DoD information handling throughout the DIB. And it took a few years for the first action to hit the street. So if you move forward to 2015, the DoD issued the DFARS 252.204 TAC 7012 clause, which focused on safeguarding covered defense information and cyber incident reporting. So then continuing to move forward, the next few years were focused on DFARS. So in December of 2016, NIST Special Publication 800-171 Rev 2 was released. And then a year later, in December of 2017, the DoD called for all contracts to implement the DFARS 7012 clause. In March of 2019, CMMC development commenced later that year. And then in June, NIST 800-171 Rev 2 was finally released. And that's the version that we follow today. Moving to January of 2020, CMMC version 1.0 was released and then versioned throughout that year. In response to public comment, then in November of 2021, CMMC version 2.0 was released, and the updated framework stripped away extras and realigned to the NIST Special Publication 800-171 Rev 2 requirements. In August of 2022, the voluntary assessment period commenced via the Joint Surveillance Program, and that was a partnership between authorized certified third-party assessors organization, or the C3PAOs, and the Defense Industrial Base Cybersecurity Assessment Center, or DIDCAC, which is AKA the government auditors. In July of 2023, the DoD submitted CMMC to the Office of Management and Budget's Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs for the final rulemaking. And then moving to December of 2023, the proposed final rule was published with a public comment period that would conclude in February of 2024. The ruling went back and forth for final review in June of 2024 and was published into the Federal Register on October 15th of 2024. And now we are at present. So obviously the final rule has an effective date of mid-December. And then looking into next year, the contract implications will commence and likely begin in late Q1 or Q2 of 2025. And that's all dependent on the output of finalization of 48 CFR, which enables the new DFARS clause to enforce CMMC. Lizzie, over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. So that was a lot, but really, I think it's important for us to recognize this journey that the DoD has been on. And most of you have been along for the ride, at least partially on this journey. But this isn't new. So this has been going on for a while. DoD feels as though they've sort of communicated this to the masses over the course of this time frame. But still, there's a lot to digest and a lot to learn. So I'd like to switch over to Bobby now. If you could give us a little bit of background on, what is CMMC? What are the details here?
Thank you, Lizzie. Yeah, so what is the cybersecurity maturity model certification, and why is it required, and then how will you comply, or how will you be certified, right? So what is CMMC? So fundamentally, it's a pre-award assessment methodology that's going to help determine whether a prospective defense industrial-based contractor has implemented the cybersecurity protections necessary to adequately safeguard the Defense Department's sensitive information, namely in the form of controlled unclassified information or potentially federal contract information. And why is it required? Ultimately, it's been determined it's required to increase the cybersecurity posture of the defense industrial base, and to better protect that sensitive information. So how does certification work as far as like the how, right? So all defense contractors and their subcontractors, that's really important to note, must show compliance with the 110 for CMMC level 2, and we'll get into that in a moment, with all the security requirements based on the CMMC level that you are obtaining. And that's going to be either through a self-assessment process, or for most our contractors, defense contractors, it's going to be through a third-party assessment, and that is going to be required prior to contract award under the CMMC Final Rule.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for that. And these requirements, as Caitlin demonstrated with the timeline there, have been around for a while. So can we talk about what those requirements really are and where they've been?
Yes, so exactly as Caitlin kind of noted on that timeline, if they sound familiar, it's because they've been around for a while, and they are certainly based off of two regulations. Fundamentally, the first one is the FAR, the Federal Acquisition Regulation, namely the 52.20421 regulation, and that's going to apply to all federal government agencies, not just the Department of Defense contractors. And that basically mandates that you implement 15 of the basic cybersecurity safeguards and protections, and that's to protect the government's federal contract information. So you'll see that in contract language, the FAR 52.20421. You'll also potentially see, if you're for CMMC level 2, namely you're going to see the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement, DFARS clauses as well, and I'll go over a few of them. The first one is the 252.204.7012. Most of our contractors that we support have this clause, and this is where the government has flowed down controlled unclassified information to them, and therefore the mandate is to protect and safeguard that information, and also to implement the security controls in the NIST Special Publication 800-171 Alpha Revision 2. I'll talk a little bit about that because you may be wondering, or if you may have heard, that there is a NIST 800-171 Revision 3 that was published earlier this year. However, the CMMC Final Rule states that the Revision 2 is the framework of choice for the CMMC program at this time. So that is a framework that you must implement according to DFARS 252.204.7012. Another DFARS clause is the 252.204.7019, and this is basically the requirement that a defense contractor has to be able to have a basic NIST assessment and record that in the Supplier Performance Risk System, which is SPRS, and that needs to be done at least every 3 years. That's mandated in 7019. And then in DFARS 252.204.7020, that allows the government access to your facilities, your systems, and your personnel for what's kind of determined as a random DoD medium or high assessment. That was prior to the new CMMC rule.
Great. So these are all about really protecting that FCI and CUI, and these are our levels for CMMC. Can you give us some of the background there?
Sure. So again, with CMMC 2.0, these three levels have been around for a while. The original CMMC 1.0 originally did have 5 levels of compliance, but the 3 levels has been established for some time, and there was no change here, with the exception of the level 1, which is the protection of federal contract information. There's now 15 requirements, and that aligns perfectly with the FAR 252.204.21 clause that I talked about earlier. Those 15 basic security requirements, those align perfectly now with CMMC level 1. As far as level 2, there are 110 security requirements that align with the NIST 800-171 Alpha Revision 2 that I just spoke about. And for CMMC level 3, they will also must comply with CMMC level 2 requirements, in addition to 24 additional security requirements outlined in the NIST 800-172 publication. I will add, I kind of talked a little bit about just the controls, the 15 and the 110 and the 134 controls. Those controls also include assessment objectives. So those assessment objectives are also required for compliance for CMMC. So there's really more than 110 controls that you have to comply with for CMMC level 2. For CMMC level 2, there are 320 assessment objectives or checkpoints that you must comply with and document and be able to exhibit compliance there. And for CMMC level 1, there's 59.
Great, thank you so much. So those were a good background on CMMC, gave you a little bit of color on where we've been, what the kind of core fundamentals of CMMC are. But what happened on October 15th was the 32 CFR was published. The 32 CFR is the CMMC rule. So everything is now in black and white in the Federal Register and describes what CMMC is and requires. And certainly it's building upon all of the years of work that has gone into this. And it is all built on that NIST Special Publication 800-171 Rev 2. So we know what those basics are. We have a lot more clarity on some of the things that were gray in the past. But now what? Now that it's final, what is next? And how is CMMC really going to be implemented across the supply chain? So I'll send it back to you, Caitlin, to give us a little more clarity there on what's next.
Thank you, Lizzie. So yes, like you just mentioned, the 32 CFR has been finalized, and that's the CMMC rule. But now we also have to look at the 48 CFR, which is the new DFARS clause that actually enforces CMMC by putting it into DoD contracts. The new DFARS clause 252-7021 will specify the CMMC level that is required and then the associated flow down requirements. Now, the public comment period for 48 CFR just closed on October 15th, and there were about 54 comments, which is a very manageable amount for the DoD to adjudicate in a timely manner. And we would expect that that process is going to take anywhere from 60 to 90 days, pushing us into Q1 of 2025. So from there, 48 would be published in the Federal Register, and then it would take another 60 days until the final effective date.
Okay, thank you so much. So that takes us into when all of this kind of starts to happen. And the DoD has shared with us their timeline of how they're going to roll that out. So can you help us kind of understand what that timeline is?
Yeah, so the rollout officially becomes effective when 48 CFR is put into place, and that's going to be late Q1 2025 or potentially Q2 2025. And then the 4-phase rollout would be able to begin. So phase 1 of that is that the DoD may choose to include level 2 C3PAOs assessment requirements in place of level 2 self-assessment requirements in applicable DoD solicitations and contracts. Phase 2 would be in addition to phase 1 allowances, the DoD can begin to include level 2 C3PO assessment requirements in applicable DoD solicitations and contracts as a condition of the contract award. Phase 3 would be in addition to phase 1 and phase 2 allowances, the DoD can begin to include level 2 C3PAO assessment requirements and options to exercise active DoD contracts. And then phase 4, DoD will begin including CMMC program requirements in all applicable DoD solicitations and contracts, including option periods on contracts awarded prior to the beginning of phase 4.
Awesome, thank you. So we have a time frame now. We kind of know a little bit more about what's expected of us as defense contractors moving forward. So we see when the DFARS, the new DFARS clause, our 7021 clause, we'll refer to it, when that's final, phase 1 begins. And it's about 12 months that we expect this to happen. But as Caitlin mentioned, although what's stated here is that first 12-month period, they're probably going to rely heavily on the self-assessment, very similar to what you've probably experienced with your 7012 clauses, where you've published a score in the SPRS. The DoD may choose to include a requirement for C3PAO assessment. So there's definitely some emphasis there that you really need to be taking action and getting ready. The other thing that I would just underscore here with all of this is capacity for C3PAOs. I think that's part of the reason we see this rollout that's going to allow for some of the self-assessment. Capacity is pretty light right now. There's only about 58 authorized certified third-party assessor organizations, which means that the line to get in is expected to be fairly long. So I know just anecdotally in talking to some of the C3PO partners that we have, I was a part of a panel with one a couple weeks ago, and he was scheduling out through June right now. Talked to another one that's currently scheduling for Q1. So there is varied levels of availability, but it's just one of those things that you probably want to watch closely and keep this timeline in the back of your mind as you're trying to make your plans. Okay, so I also want to take a look at some of the key changes and updates that are in the final rule. So some of the things that maybe we weren't clear about before, we didn't know specifically how DoD was going to specify that. So Dustin, I'd like to turn to you to talk about some of these kind of key requirements that we saw with the publishing of that final rule.
Yep, absolutely. So first of all, the vast majority of the DoD contractors will be required level 1 or level 2 compliance. Very few will actually be looking for level 3, so we'll kind of scope in on just level 2. Implementation of the 110 security controls is a requirement to safeguard CUI. They will allow for some POA&Ms, but to reiterate on something that Bobby had mentioned before, with 320 subcontrols, if one of the subcontrols is not met, the whole control is not met. So that kind of will bleed into some of the POA&Ms that are allowed. So if you do have a control that is deemed not compliant during your C3PAO assessment, depending on the control, we can still be okay. The goal is we have to score at least an 88 of what the current SPRS scoring system is. In addition to that, none of the level 3 or 5 controls can be non-compliant, so we can only have POA&Ms for some of those lower tier controls, and none of the 15 controls in level 1 can be non-compliant. The POA&Ms are going to give you 180 days to remediate some of the gaps that they identify if you do end up POA&Ming one of the allowable controls. Then the assessor will come back on site and reassess the gaps. Some of the news on the cloud service providers. So if a organization is using a cloud service provider to store, process, or transmit CUI, the cloud service provider must meet FedRAMP moderate baseline equivalent requirements. If they are not processing CUI, for example, if we have some sort of SIEM or multi-factor, those tools will not need to meet the FedRAMP standards. Instead, they will be deemed as security assets and will just be assessed as part of the assessment. For example, access controls into remote management tools and those kinds of things. That kind of extends into managed service providers. They will, those services all fall within the organization's compliance boundary and will be subject to the assessment. But the managed service provider will not need to obtain a separate CMMC certification as the responsibility of the compliance lies to the organization utilizing the services. A couple of things about flow down requirements. If you do have leveraged some subcontractors to perform on some of the contracts, those subcontractors will also need to meet the level of requirement that you are achieving. So if you're going to pass CUI to a subcontractor, they will need to have their own CMMC level 2 certification. Some recent news that came out in the ruling was also about VDI, virtual desktop infrastructure. As of recently, as long as VDI environments only allow for keyboard, video, and mouse controls and no other extra like commands from the endpoint's actually deemed out of scope. So just the VDI will be in scope. And that is everything we have, Lizzie.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you. I think there's a lot in here that is clarifying for those of you who've been really kind of following this closely, particularly as it relates to cloud service providers. We all rely on them in one way, shape, or form. So now we have a better understanding of what that expectation is going to be. And then external service providers. This was a really kind of contentious area for a lot of people, not really understanding how their external IT managed service provider would be evaluated as part of this process. So having that clarity now to understand that they are just really in scope and part of your assessment helps a lot, particularly for the small organizations that are relying on maybe smaller external IT service providers. Certainly, I've seen some reference there about an external service provider that has a lot of customers. They may want to pursue their own certification because if you have quite a few, you would be spending a lot of time going through the assessment process for each of those customers. So there may be some advantages to pursuing that on your own. So certainly something to consider as you can continue to dig in and fully understand all of these elements. And then that minimum score. So what this tells me is that the DoD has recognized the need to be a little more flexible with our business community, the defense industrial base contractors. Previously, it was written in a way that suggested a lot of very black and white way of looking at things. And this does provide a little flexibility. It's a little bit more business friendly so that really the intent and spirit of this is to get mature and to start putting these things in place and certainly to build over time more and more abilities in there. So I'm pleased to see that minimum score in there in the plan of action and milestones to enable companies to continue to iterate forward. We would love to kind of dig into some more questions as we move forward. So if there are audience questions, we'd love to hear from you now to kind of get your input on some of the things that are kind of alarming to you right now or things that you're just scratching your head about. I've got it opened here and we'll be monitoring to see questions as they arise. I think a good first place maybe to start from a question standpoint is related to documentation. So I think as we're moving in to the CMMC Final Rule, and we're starting to see companies go through the C3PAO assessments as part of that joint surveillance program that Caitlin referenced. There have been somewhere over 100 companies that have gone through that now, and we're starting to get some feedback from those companies. I know we had a customer that went through the joint surveillance. What kinds of things are you hearing and learning about the need for documentation and the level of documentation that assessors are requiring? So I would kind of open that to anyone, but maybe to Bobby in particular.
Sure. Thanks, Lizzie. I'll take this one. Yeah, so as you know, CMMC is not just a technology, a goal. It's certainly going to, when they assess you, they're going to be looking at people, processes, and technology. So you could have an unlimited IT budget, but that's not going to get you to CMMC compliance, right? So it's really important from the documentation perspective that you have well-documented policies and procedures and processes, as well as a very well-documented system security plan. Equally important, if you do have, Dustin kind of talked about those cloud service providers and external service providers. If you do utilize those, you need to have either a shared responsibility matrix or a customer responsibility matrix that really just outlines those key roles and those shared responsibilities on what you as the defense contractor is responsible for and what you've kind of outsourced out to your partners. So that's going to be super important to showcase to an assessor during the assessment. What else? Obviously regular updates. Anytime your environment changes, that system security plan, that's a living document. That should be. It's also one of the security controls, but that is really important to make sure that is kept up to date, along with all your other documentation as well.
Yeah, just follow-up question on system security plan. So you talked about objective level previously. Can you talk about that as it relates to the system security plan? How it needs to be documented?
I'm sorry?
How it needs to be documented, the objectives, the objective level for
absolutely.
The controls.
Yes, so absolutely. So as I said before, there's 110 security controls for CMMC level 2, but you really need to look at 320 things that you need to comply with, really, and that's what will need to be documented. So we've assessed organizations where they've asked us to do an assessment, and they already had a system security plan. So when we reviewed that, though, they kind of only documented it to the 110 security control levels, and they kind of summarized. They kind of just summarized the control and how they meet compliance. But the NIST 800-171 alpha is very clear, and there's in essence requirements or kind of questions on how you must comply with each of those additional assessment objectives. Some controls could have as many as 7 or 8 different requirements to meet the compliance for that single control. So yes, we're definitely looking for that detailed and that expanded documentation in your system security plan to account for all those assessment objectives.
Very good, very good. So we did have a question come in, and this one is just really asking for us to expand a bit more on the requirements for MSPs and cloud processing of CUI information. So maybe just digging in a little bit more deeply on what requirements are now that we can see what the final rule has to say.
Yeah, so again, it's essentially anything, and Josh, if you have any specific questions, please feel free to write them in the chat, but specifically anything processing CUI as far as a cloud service provider will need to have that FedRAMP moderate attestation, which should be something that a salesperson or the company should be able to provide to you, that they've gone through a third-party assessment for the FedRAMP. And But the big part is that managed service providers, whereas previously thought would need their own CMMC certification, are not going to end up to need their own CMMC certification. Rather, the tools themselves will be assessed as part of the organization's CMMC audit.
All right. Does that help answer? Like Dustin said, if you've got some more questions, we're happy to dig in more there. I want to talk a little bit about primes, what to expect with prime contractors flowing things down. Because I know many of you on the call may be subcontractors, so you may not have that direct government contract, but you may be subject to the flow down requirements of the clauses in this new 7021 clause that is forthcoming. What kinds of expectations can these subcontractors maybe expect to see, and when could they start to see some implications for getting ready with CMMC?
So for flow down, you're referring to flow down requirements, Lizzie?
Yes.
Yeah, so that's going to be, again, important that the prime contractors communicate with their subcontractors. I know on a previous slide we talked about subcontractors also having those requirements. So ultimately, if it's just a flow down process. So if the Department of Defense has entrusted the prime contractor with that sensitive information, namely controlled unclassified information, in the form of a DFARS 7012 clause, so there any supplier or subcontractor that you obviously rely on to do some of that work, that same requirement and clause needs to be basically inserted into that contract as well, and they will also must meet those requirements as well.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. I'll share that prime contractors, the big guys, those big name brand people you've all heard of and maybe work for or with some of them, they are inherently risk averse, and we are seeing more and more often that they are starting to be pretty specific about what they're expecting of their subcontractors now. They are saying, hey, I want to see you have a certain score. So we've heard that many times from subcontractors, and you know, our answer is, well, it's not really required. That score was not required prior to now that we know what that score is. But I think those prime contractors were starting to see the writing on the wall and recognize if they are putting together these teams that they expect to be on a 5-year contract with, they want to be sure that you're going to be able to meet compliance. So I think a lot of you as subcontractors may start to feel a push from your prime contractor before that clause appears in a contract that you're on, because they're really wanting to set up their teams for success and make sure that you've got the ability to achieve compliance when the time is right. So I think you may start to see that. We've had some specific anecdotal information from some of our customers lately. One really in the last couple of weeks since the final rule is out, where their prime said, hey, if you don't get these specific controls in place, we can't communicate with you electronically anymore. So some very specific things are starting to kind of bubble up to the top. So definitely subcontractors kind of be on the lookout for that and start having those conversations with your primes often and early, so that you know what's going to be expected of you. I think we've got a few more things coming in here. Here's one. As a subcontractor and working at a combatant command, we're required to take online training through JKO annually. Will these training requirements help our CMMC certification? And this is, whether you're a subcontractor or a prime, if you're participating in some of these online training courses. I'm not familiar with JKO, but some of you on the panel might be. But it sounds like it's, cyber related training. Is that going to help?
Yeah, I guess I can take this one too. So short answer is absolutely. So ultimately it's going to be the organization, right? I talked about the system security plan and your policies. So if the organization has government contractors, right, that are already mandated by the government to complete mandatory DoD CUI training or the DoD cyber awareness training courses for information security courses on an annual basis. Those will absolutely meet the requirements if it's the company policy and it's documented, right? So ultimately, the organization seeking certification or assessment is going to outline all that in their policy or their system security plan. So, for example, they might write that we certain perhaps certain employees leverage maybe your HR platform or something to do some of the training, but our government contractors are going to do the JKO or the DoD cyber. So ultimately, the artifacts will have to be collected, right? So those training certificates that will have to be collected by the training manager or whomever is responsible for maintaining the training compliance at the defense contractor.
Thank you. So a lot of there is a whole awareness and training domain in the NIST framework. So certainly any work going towards improving awareness and training of your team is going to be valuable for the organization as a whole. There's another question about training. So are MSP personnel working on contract IT required to complete the cybersecurity training? Have we seen any guidance on that?
So if they have access to CUI, then yes, they would. And there's also role-based training requirements as well. So there are probably some additional training requirements that you have to justify as well on your IT personnel it's regarding their roles, their certain roles that they have in the organization or supporting the organization.
Thank you.
Lizzie,
yes,
there was another question a little bit further up that I could take, and it was,
sure.
Is there any particular format that the security system plan needs to be in? And the short answer is yes. Ideally, what you're looking to do is you're following the NIST special publication 800-171 Rev 2 and all of those different controls. And then, like Bobby mentioned, the sub controls within those. So your SSP is going to directly comment on every control and what implementation you have in place to address that control.
And to add to that, there are other bullet points that need to be hit on top of that, such as network description, with a network map and a narrative, call tree for your information security officer and your systems information owner and those kinds of things as well. But yeah, exactly.
There's another question from an MSP perspective about just kind of clarifying again, MSPs supporting the client that requires CMMC, do they need to have CMMC? So I think we clarified that is not a requirement anymore, that's what we expected in the proposed final rule, but now the clarity that came out with the final rule is indicating that those IT managed service providers do not have to obtain their own certification. Correct. Right. We talked a lot about the documentation that's required and the time that kind of goes into creating that, the system security plan, the level of detail that's required to go into documenting your implementation of those controls and safeguards. What are you seeing in terms of timing that it takes for an organization to really put those pieces in place? And what's that breakdown? So you've got the documentation piece, but there's also technical controls that need to be addressed. So what are you seeing for what it's taking companies from a timing perspective?
So generally, of course, kind of based on an assessment, right, to kind of identify gaps. But generally, most small businesses don't have the resources, right, to have a mature policies and procedures and everything. So there's always going to be something to improve on. So generally, we generally see like a 12 to 18 month remediation effort. So it certainly is and the main reason is again, everyone that is going to have every stakeholder in that organization has another full-time job, right? So no one generally don't have the time to just devote, full-time 40 hours a week to just CMMC compliance. So even when you're working with a partner to help you with that, whether it's an IT provider or another organization to aid you with that, certainly you're still involved with that. So it's very lengthy, and it can take a year to a year and a half at times.
Yeah, that's definitely good to have in mind as you think to that timeline for the rollout that we looked at. So recognizing that obviously depends where you're starting from too. You may have some maturity already in place, so you're not starting from zero. But certainly we've seen with a lot of our customers that maybe it can be fast tracked a little bit more than that, but there is truly a commitment needed internally from the organization to be able to start rolling out various policies and processes and those kinds of things. Bobby, do you have something to add there?
Yeah, I'll also just add that again, when you're doing this, you're trying to be as least disruptive as possible on your operations, right? So again, you're not trying to just go in and rip out all the technology and put in new equipment and software and resources and technology. So there's a lot of organizational change management that needs to occur, right? Working with your team, making sure they understand what's going on, and again, just being as having the least disruption as possible with the operations, because you certainly still have a job to do.
Sure. What do you see? You guys have each worked with a variety of different companies. It's different levels of maturity. Are there some common areas that are just seem to be kind of hard to implement, or there are just always gaps in specific areas? Or is there anything that rises to the top as some of the things that might be challenging?
I would say the most common one is the FIPS encryption, ensuring that at rest and in transit, CUI is encrypted with FIPS validated algorithms and modules. Definitely be the highest one.
That was one, I think, in the final rule that came out that they would give partial credit for. Is that correct? That was one that they said that's a 5-pointer. Because I know, Dustin, when you talked earlier about the 5-pointers that wouldn't be eligible for a POA&M, I think that was an exception to that rule.
Yep, that's I think the only 5-pointer that they allow for a POA&M, and that's if you have encryption, but it's not fully FIPS validated. So that's also one of the ones that you can get partial credits for, and that would be a 3-point. Yeah.
Okay, so at least DoD's recognizing that one's hard. Yeah. What else? Anybody else have some ideas of some of the hard ones?
I don't know about hard, but multi-factor authentication is one that's we don't often find implemented. That's often a gap. I'll add something that's not really technology based, but just the kind of organizations that have been, doing work for the DoD for some time and have been working with 7012 clauses for some time. And they really don't have a great handle on where the CUI is flowing, right? So we haven't really talked about that, but one of the requirements for CMMC certification is to be able to document and showcase that the control of the CUI flow in your organization. So we often kind of sometimes find that where it's just anywhere and everywhere on their network, right? And they don't really have a great boundary, and that can be challenging as well.
And I'll add to that if we have a moment, Lizzie, that documentation here is always key. That you may be the most mature in your technical implementations, you might have all of these things in place, but unless you have documentation that provides all of your implementation and that you've rolled this out to the company and that users are complying, then it's kind of a moot point until you get that all written out.
Right. Talking about that flow of CUI, I think kind of back to maybe the very, very basic part of maybe where to start. If you're an organization that is really just getting started, you're just figuring this all out. I know the scope is important. So can you talk a little bit about understanding the scope and how organizations might tackle that, understanding what that scope of their FCI and CUI environment might be?
Sure. So yeah, that's really paramount. I kind of talked about, knowing where it flows. And that's really going to be important to for any small business, right? With certainly limited resources. We want to try to keep costs down as much as possible, right? So that's for CMMC compliance, CMMC certification, while also meeting the requirements in the DFARS clauses, right? So one way to do that is to try to reduce the scope as much as possible. So by limiting, the flow of that CUI to certain systems, having some logical and physical separation and creating some boundaries that can ultimately reduce cost is also going to make managing that environment more manageable. And generally, what you hear the term is an enclave, right? So having a CUI enclave, I know some organizations maybe only 20-30% of their business is supporting the defense industrial base. The rest of it is supporting private industry. So they, instead of making the entire organization in scope, they have kind of identified those CUI assets, and they've created a boundary around that. And then they're safeguarding that with both physical and logical protections.
Okay, thank you. So I know we have just a few minutes left. Certainly we'll monitor the chat if some more questions come in there, but I would like to turn it to each of you just to share maybe some kind of key takeaway, either from the final rule or just something that you think that this audience should be thinking about as it relates to CMMC and this next stage of the CMMC journey where there is going to be requirements and contracts and what kinds of things they should really be thinking about. I don't know who might like to start. Dustin, look at you.
Definitely start your documentation now. Don't wait until the last minute, because definitely it's a heavy lift. And even if we are to get everything wrapped up on time, we want to be on the list for the C3PAOs, because that list is definitely getting large. So definitely starting as soon as possible is my takeaway from this.
Great, thank you.
I'll go next. A key takeaway would be that the C3PAO assessments start on December 16th. So for anybody that's ready, The third-party assessments can help demonstrate your competitiveness in any upcoming contract bids. And then for others, doing a rigorous self-assessment is the first step to then becoming third-party certified once you're confident in meeting that threshold.
Great advice. Yeah, great advice. And we've learned a lot about the C3PAO assessments through that joint surveillance program that's been around since August of 2022. So we do have a little bit more clarity in what that process looks like, but it becomes the standard joint, or no longer a joint surveillance, but standard assessment in mid-December. So we'll see companies starting to really actively go through that.
Yeah, and I guess I'll close by kind of summarizing what Caitlin and Dustin said. And Dustin kind of foot stomped the documentation, but I would say really just if you haven't already started, your preparation for CMMC, the rule is real. It's a final and it's official, and so there was certainly some speculation that it may not ever get to this point. So I would say it's not too late. Prepare now. Understand what your DFARS contractual requirements are, right? So if you have that 70-12 clause that we talked about, you certainly will be required to meet CMMC level 2 certification. And you're not alone, right? There are certainly lots of organizations in the CMMC ecosystem that can support you and help you with those things that we talked about for CUI scoping and doing an assessment on your security controls and kind of seeing where you are in your journey. So it's not too late. So certainly just get started as soon as possible.
Yeah, that's great. Great advice. You're not alone. There's lots of other companies out there that are going through this with you. Certainly seek out support as you need it. Lots of great resources that you can read about. I think there's a lot of content like this that's coming out right now in light of the final rule. So as you have questions, please feel free to send them our way. Happy to have a one-on-one discussion with you and help you understand maybe how this applies to your specific environment. I think underscoring some of the messages that we've heard today, understand your scope. So understand what part of your organization is in scope for protecting that federal contract information or that controlled unclassified information or that level 1 or level 2 requirement that you may have. Really assess yourself against the controls and the requirements. So recognize what those 110 controls are and those 320 objectives and how you align with them. Start to build a plan for any of the gaps. So if you've not got something implemented, we see this a lot. I would say this is another common thing that we've seen with our customers is they might be doing it, but they don't have it written down. So if you are maybe doing something, but you don't have that documented process, start writing it down because getting those things in writing is going to be critical to your success moving forward. And then start evaluating C3PAOs. So when you're a little further down the road and you're getting close, start to talk to some of those C3PAOs and understand what their process is and how you might fit into that. We have seen the majority of the C3PAO assessments are done virtually with certain controls being assessed on site if applicable. So depending on that organization. So just another kind of data point for you to recognize there. But we are basically at the end of our hour and we want to be respectful of everyone's time. So just thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for your questions. This was very helpful. And we look forward to helping provide more clarity as you continue to move forward in this process. All right. Thank you so much. With that, we will conclude.